and like all this seems to work quite nicely. And so since this all works, it's very difficult for me to understand how it's not predicated, at least in large part, on competence. And then, of course, there's the other evidence, which is, well, you know, a lot of you are older than the average person would have been when he or she died throughout the history of the entire human race. And so that seems to be working out pretty good for you. And none of you are skinny. Quite the contrary. So there are more obese people in the world now than there are starving people by quite a substantial majority. And I think that that's worth quite the celebration, even though it's perhaps not exactly optimized. But it's definitely better than the alternative. And, you know, by and large, we're moderately healthy. And most women don't die in childbirth like they used to, and most children don't die within a year of being born like they used to, not very long ago. And so things seem to be working. Not so bad, given what a bloody catastrophe life is, and how difficult it is to get things to work, and how fragile people are, and how short-lived we are intrinsically, and how vulnerable we are to suffering. We're not doing so bad, you know. We must be doing something right. And this is the thing. This is the thing that I would say enrages me about, let's call them universities. And it's the intellectual and moral laziness of the resentful victimization, power, postmodern doctrine. Because, look, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the history of humanity is a bloody nightmare. And, you know, to lay that only at the feet of human beings, I think, is a mistake. Because life in the natural world is a bloody nightmare. And so you can't just blame that on people. You know, like you can blame it on people to some degree. We take a bad thing, or we take a deadly thing, or a dangerous thing, and we can make it worse. And we definitely do that. But it's not like the problem is simple to begin with, because it's clearly the case that at every moment, the planet is trying to kill you. And eventually it will succeed. And so that's a big problem. And it's reasonable for us to group together and to try to stop that. And while we're doing that, we cause some trouble. You know, we pollute things and we break things, and we don't play as good an iterating game as we might. But, you know, for creatures that only last 8 decades and have a lot of trouble during all 8 of those, we don't do that badly. And we've got our reasons for being as perverse and useless as we are. And all of that shouldn't be laid at our feet, even though we need to take responsibility for it. And so one of the things that I find extremely disturbing about the emergent hypothesis that our culture is nothing but an oppressive patriarchy is that it's ungrateful beyond comprehension. And worse, if you adopt that stance, well, it bestows a certain amount of benefit on you. I mean, first of all, if you posit that there's nothing in your culture except what's corrupt, then that immediately elevates you above all of it as that sort of critic, right? It's like, well, I'm taking the high ground and I'm looking at the entire history of humanity and calling it unacceptable. It's like, well, that's fine, I suppose, except it isn't necessarily obvious that you could do any better, and you probably haven't. You know, and maybe you could try, although then you might say, well, just try, all that trying does is make it worse. And participating in that terror, doing anything of any utility, is just playing the power game and making it worse. It's like, yeah, well, you know, pardon me for being a bit skeptical about your motivation. I don't think that moral virtue is that easily come by. And I think that there are difficult problems to solve, and that you could contend with the world and try to solve them instead of complaining about the fact that they haven't been solved properly. And that if you did manage to solve a problem or two, which you might, then maybe you'd have the right to stand up as a more global critic. But until then, well, what's Rule 6? You should get your house in order before you criticize the world. And that's no simple thing. But so the moral virtue thing, that's annoying, because I don't think that moral virtue should be unearned. You know, this is kind of why I'm an admirer of the doctrine of original sin. You know, I think you're stuck with some concept of original sin no matter how you think. I mean, I see that in the atheistic environmentalist types, and I know all environmentalist types aren't atheistic, and I know that all environmentalist types aren't reprehensible either. But there's a nice selection of atheist environmental types who are reprehensible. And they're usually the ones that say that the world would be better off if there were fewer people on it, which is not a sentiment that I find particularly attractive. And it's also one, when I meet someone who utters that, I always think two things. One is, well, why are you still here then? That's the first one. And the second one is, just exactly who is it that you're planning on getting rid of, and how exactly would you go about doing that if you had the opportunity? So I don't find that particularly admirable, and I don't think that there's any sympathy in it, you know, because I think that we should have some sympathy for ourselves. That's Rule 2, is you should treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping. Or Rule 3, which is you should make friends with people who want the best for you. It's like, corrupt and useless as you are, you do have a hard lot. You know, and so there's some reason for sympathy. And to say that human beings are nothing but despoilers of the planet is to miss half the story, which is, as fast as we're trying to kill Mother Nature, she is returning the favor in spades. So that doesn't mean that we should be foolish about it, you know, and a certain balance has to be attained. But it's nice to look at both sides of the equation before you lay out too much judgment. You know, back in the late 1800s, Thomas Huxley, who was Aldous Huxley's great-grandfather and also a great defender of Darwin, was commissioned by the British Parliament to do a study on oceanic resources, because there was some concern at that point that human beings might be overfishing. And his conclusion was the oceans were so bountiful and plentiful, and human beings so comparatively small in number and powerless, that there wasn't a hope in hell that we would ever be able to put a dent in the vast resources of the ocean. And that was only at the beginning of the 20th century. You know, we didn't get to the point where we could harvest on an industrial scale until after World War II. You know, that's only about 70 years ago. And so it's only been 50 years, say, maybe a bit more, 60 years, maybe since 1960, that we woke up to the fact that some of our actions had now become powerful enough to be considered on a global scale. And that's within the lifetime. That's within my lifetime. That's within the lifetime of a single person. I don't think we've done such a bad job of waking up since then and starting to understand that, you know, maybe we have a larger scale moral obligation than we realized before, that's proportionate to our technological power. It's another place where a little bit of sympathy might be in order. You know, and I mean, LA is a lot cleaner than it used to be in terms of its air quality, and so is London. And, you know, we've made a lot of progress, I would say, in a relatively short time trying to clean up the mess that we made when we were trying not to die painfully young. You know, so all right, well, back to this ethic. So I'll tell you another study that I really like that's really cool. So this was a study that was done by a guy named Jaak Panksepp, and he did it with rats. And now and then, I love reading animal experimental work. If you want to study psychology, that's what you should read. You should just read animal experimental work, because those people, it's not all good, but some of it's really good. And some of the people who've done it, they were real scientists. And this guy Panksepp, he's one of them. got another guy's named Jeffrey Gray, who wrote a book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which takes you like 8 months to read. It's a really hard book, but it's brilliant. Anyways, Panksepp has done a really good job of laying out the fundamental motivational systems in their biology. I'll just tell you a brief story about that. The American Psychological Association just came out with its guidelines for the treatment of men and boys. It's actually, they're not guidelines, they're not for treatment, and they're certainly not for the improvement of the health of men and boys. It's an absolutely reprehensible ideological screed on how psychologists have to think politically so they won't be punished by those who accredit them. That's it fundamentally. But one of the claims they made two claims that are beyond comprehension to me. The first one was that aggression is socialized. So that's the first claim. And the second claim is that boys are socialized into aggression by men. Okay, so let's look at those. This relates to Panksepp. So Panksepp outlined a bunch of biological circuits. So human beings, like mammals, but also like even more archaic animals, speaking evolutionarily, have a variety of fundamental biological circuits. So I can tell you some of them. Some of them are obvious and some of them are somewhat surprising. You have a circuit for pain. Well, there's no surprise. You have a circuit for anxiety. That's circuit, it's a metaphor, obviously. You have a biological system that mediates anxiety. All of you have it. Animals have it. You have one for something called incentive reward, and that's what moves you towards valued goals. That's basically associated with positive emotion. You have one that satisfies you when you consume. That's a consummatory reward system. Lust, that's another one. Thirst, hunger. Play, that's cool. That's a fundamental circuit. Panksepp discovered that. There's a circuit for care. That's another one. And there's a circuit for rage. That's not all of them, but that's a good start. Rage. It's there right from the beginning. If you do facial expression coding analysis of infants, say an infant learns to recognize its mother, and then that's around 9 months often, or even earlier than that. So a person comes into the baby's room and the baby starts to cry because that person isn't the mother. And you think, oh, the baby's sad. It's like, no, the baby isn't sad. The baby is angry. That's why it's turning red. And if you do facial expression coding, it's like the baby is actually, the baby is cursing internally. And you already know this because you know that like a 2-year-old isn't much older than a baby, and 2-year-olds have temper tantrums, and it's not because they're sad, as you can tell perfectly well if you just watch a 2-year-old have a temper tantrum. It's clear that they're completely possessed by rage. And that rage circuit, it's exactly right. That rage circuit is active even before the fear circuit is active. It's activated very early. And one of the things that's the case is that some children are much more aggressive than others, right from the beginning. And most of those are boys. And not all of them, but most of them. And if you take 2-year-olds and you group them together, you find if you take 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, all the way up to 16, and you group them together, they don't know each other, and then you count aggressive actions, the 2-year-olds are by far the most aggressive bunch. They kick and hit and bite and steal. Not all of them, but a good chunk of them. And so, and 16-year-olds don't do that when you put them together. And look, you're all here, and you're not 16, you're like 30, and you're not doing any of that. And so 2-year-olds, man, they're aggressive little monsters. And it's okay because they're small and soft, and what the hell can they do, So it's not like, it's not blood warfare among 2-year-olds, but it's just because they don't have the sophistication and the weapons. They've got the motivation. And it's really true. It's really true for a subset of them. So about 5% of 2-year-old boys are hyper-aggressive. But what's cool is that almost all of them are socialized into civilized behavior by the time they're 4. And you can define civilized behavior actually quite nicely using a Piagetian definition, is that other children will play with them. And that's rule 5, by the way. Don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. What's your job if you're a parent? Your job as a parent is to socialize your children so that by the age of 3, other children will play with them. Because that means they've learned how to engage in reciprocal social interactions, and that'll start to spiral upwards. So if your child is acceptable as a playmate by the age of 3, age of 4 is the limit, by the way, so you better have it together by then. Otherwise they get alienated and isolated and they don't make friends, and then they never recover from that. It's not good. It's not good. So most kids are socialized, even the hyper-aggressive ones are socialized into acceptable playmates by the age of 4. And it's men, in large part, that do that. Now, what's the evidence for that? Well, there's lots of evidence for it. The evidence among mammals is the use of rough and tumble play, for example, among males and their offspring in order to socialize and civilize them. But the evidence among human beings is that where do you get aggressive teenagers? What sort of families produce aggressive teenagers? Fatherless families. Right, so let's think about that with regards to what the APA said. Okay, because what they said was the opposite of the truth. It wasn't even a lie. It wasn't even wrong. It was, they took the truth and then they claimed the opposite on 2 dimensions. Number 1, aggression isn't socialized. Civilization is socialized. Number 2, if men were responsible for the creation of aggression among boys, then fatherless families would produce boys that were more peaceful. And they don't. So what the hell, fundamentally? All right, so you have the behavioral pattern that characterizes civilized behavior among wolves, or civilized behavior among chimpanzees, or civilized behavior among rats. I'll tell you the rest of the rat story. So rats like to engage in rough and tumble play, especially juveniles, especially juvenile males. And we know they like it because they'll work to do it. So if they know that if a rat has been somewhere and he got to play, and then you put him back there, and you make him press a bar to open the door so he can go into where he played, he'll press that bar like mad. And so that's how you infer motivation among rats. Will the rat work to play? You will, right? Which is why you'll pay for tickets to a basketball game. Hell, you'll work to watch people play. Right. That's very interesting. It's absolutely, that's so important. It's almost unbelievable that you will do that. I mean, because the question is, well, why? That's the first question. Well, seriously, it's like, what the hell? What are you watching a bunch of pituitary cases go, bang a ball so that they can throw it through a hoop? And you'll pay outrageous sums of money to do that. It's like, you're not even throwing the damn ball. You're just watching them do it. Can I have the ball? No. Well, I paid $200 for this ticket. You don't get the ball. It's like, you don't get to play. Okay, well, I'll just watch. It's like, so that's how important it is. That's how important play is, that you'll work to make money to buy tickets to watch people play. Right, man, that's crazy. So, but it's fundamental, and you think about how much of our entertainment is associated with exactly that. Think, well, were we just doing something random? Or is there something important going on there? I mean, it doesn't look that important. In some sense, it's easy to be cynical about it, but it's foolish because it's crucially important, the fact that we're so wired up to admire fair play that we'll pay for it, we'll pay for the right just to watch it vicariously. That's a testament to the degree to which we're civilized and social, because a game is something that's civilized and social. Back to Piaget. Piaget believed that most socialization occurred as a consequence of integrating these underlying motivational systems into iterable games. And that's what you're doing with your kids, right? When you socialize your kids, when you teach them how to take turns, when you teach them how to play a game, then what you're doing is that you're socializing them into iterated reciprocal interactions with other people. And that's the fundamental aspect of the ethic. That's how an ethic emerges from the bottom up. It emerges in games. That was Piaget's fundamental observation. Much better than the Freudian hypothesis. The Freudian hypothesis was basically that human beings learn to inhibit their aggression. That's not Piaget's model. Piaget's model is no. You integrate the aggression into a higher order game. And you know this because you want an athlete, a good athlete is someone who's got that aggression. But it's directed, right? It's not random. In fact, if you see an athlete manifest random aggression, you're not happy about that, right? Maybe you admire them because they're really competitive, highly skilled, really competitive. They're goal-driven. They want to win. But it's all focused on the goal. And, they're cooperating with their teammates. And they're not hogging the ball. They're also facilitating the development of their teammates. And they don't cheat. They don't break the rules. So they're cooperating even with their adversaries. Because they're all playing basketball and they're all playing by the rules. It's all cooperative. That's an ethic. It's an emergent ethic. And the things that we do, what we do in our lives outside of the game is very game-like. We engage in a cooperative and competitive ethic. And we know the good players, we know the good sports, and that's the bottom-up emergence of an ethic. It's also the solution to the postmodern conundrum, as far as I'm concerned, or part of the solution, because the postmodernists claim that there's an infinite way of looking at the world, and there is, and that no way of looking at the world is better than any other way, which is wrong. The first part's right, because the world's very complicated. The second part's wrong. There aren't that many ways of playing a game properly. And you can tell that too, because even if you watch kids play, if you go out and you watch your kids play, you can tell which kids are good sports and which ones aren't. Right? That's easy. And the kids can tell too. And so you can tell when it doesn't matter what the game is, and if you're a good sport, it's the same across games, which is really another indication of the emergence of a transcendent ethic, right? If you're the concept good sportsman is independent of the game, right? And it's very much what it is that you want. It's the dawning of the behaviors that you want from someone who's sophisticated and reciprocal in their day-to-day life. And it's by no means arbitrary. It's in fact very tightly constrained. Back to the rats. So rats like to wrestle. And so you can get them to work to wrestle. And so they work, and then the door opens and out they go. And there's rat A and rat B, and rat A is 10% bigger than rat B. And so they have a little wrestling match, and rat A, who's the bigger rat, the more powerful rat, pins rat B. And then the postmodern social scientists observing derive their conclusion. Power produces dominance. And they publish it. But they're stupid. And so then you have a smart scientist, and he thinks, wait a second, you don't just wrestle once if you're a rat, you wrestle a bunch of times. And so what happens if you get the rats to wrestle more than once? Because that's the issue. And this is the difference between a psychopath and someone who's not psychopathic. So the thing about being a psychopath is that it's all for you and none for someone else. But that only works once or twice, depending on the naivety of your target. And if you're a psychopath, you have to move from place to place. Because people catch on to your lack of ability to play fair, and they don't get fooled again. And so psychopaths drift from place to place. And they can find their mark and their victim, but they can't do it in any stable manner. It's not a good solution. Because people track reputation, and we're really good at that. In fact, there are evolutionary psychologists who believe that we have a module for tracking reputation, a cheating detection module, and that you don't have to activate that very often before people will remember forever that you did. So, you got the big rat and the little rat. Now the little rat's lost. Now you separate them, and then you let them come back and play another day. And they still want to. Even the little rat wants to. And so then the little rat goes out in the play field, and the big rat's there. And the little rat has to ask the big rat to play. And you think, well, how does a rat do that? It's like, well, you've been in dog parks, and you see what dogs do. Maybe you've had dogs. You know how dogs act when they want to play. They sort of bounce around. They kind of look at you, and they bounce. And if you have any sense, you all laugh because you recognize that. There's something playful about that. It's like, I'm looking at you, signaling intent, and this is sort of like a little dance, and The idea is, why don't you come and do this with me? And if you have any sense, it's a big dog. And if you have any sense, the dog does that. And you kind of whack it on the side of the head. And it's not really that you hit it. And the dog knows. And it sort of bites you, but not really. Because, the dog knows how to play. If it had owners that I could say that weren't psychologists, because the worst dog I ever met was the dog that a psychologist owned. And it couldn't play at all. It would just bite you. It's like, what? This is your dog? You're going to have clients? Not good. So anyways, the little rat has to ask the big rat to play, because the big rat's cool, because he won once. So he gets to sit there and look cynical and pretend that he's ignoring the little rat, but he wants to play too. So the little rat bounces around, and the big rat thinks, he tosses away his cigarette butt and gets off the street corner and plays. And because he's 10% bigger, he could pin the little rat, and maybe he does that. But if you pair them repeatedly, and the big rat doesn't let the little rat win 30% of the time, the little rat stops asking him to play. And that is so cool. I read that, it just blew me away. I thought, really? You're kidding. There's an emergent ethic of fair play in wrestling rats. That's how fundamental that ethic is. I mean, they're rats, for Christ's sake. It's not like they're the world's most ethical animal, right? They're rats. And still, they have to play fair. So, what was I doing in Maps of Meaning and in 12 Rules for Life? Well, we're motivated creatures. Each of those motivations has to pursue its own goal, because otherwise we die. But then those motivations have to get integrated. They have to get integrated within you. You kind of got that more or less under control by the time you're about 2. You start to become something approximating the integration of your motivations. But that hasn't happened socially yet. That happens between 2 and 4. You have to integrate that integrated structure with everyone else doing the same thing. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by learning how to play. How to play fair. And there's a reciprocity that goes along with that. I'll give you another example. So here's a game that behavioral economists have been playing with people. So here's the game. So you take person A and you take person B, and you say to person A, look, I'm going to give you $100, and you have to share it with the person next to you. And you can offer them a fraction of it, whatever fraction you want, and if they take it, you get the $100 and you split it with them. But if they refuse it, you guys get nothing. So you say, okay, well, here's $100. How much are you going to offer the person next to you? Now, a classical economist would say, well, you offer them $1. Well, why? Well, because you're trying to maximize your own self-interest, because that's what you are. You're going to maximize your own self-interest. And why would they say no? It's like they get $1, and that's better than nothing. Why would they say no? So you say, well, will you take $1? And the person next to you says, well, they think things they won't say. But what they say is no. But what happens is, if you do this experiment, is that isn't what people do. They offer 50%. Cross-culturally, it's somewhere between 40 and 60%. But it's basically 50-50. And then the other person accepts it. And you might think, well, that's because you don't need the money. It's like, let's say, you're starving and you have the $100 and you offer your compatriot here $1. And he needs something to eat. So it's like, yeah, I'll take the $1. It's like, no. The poor people are more likely to tell you to go to hell. Because along with having no money, they'd like not to have no pride. Right? You got to hang on to something. And so you can at least still tell someone to go to hell when they deserve it. And that's something. And so even in the simple behavioral economist games, you get emergent evidence for automatic reciprocity. Well, and why would you offer 50% to the stranger? And the answer is, well, because it's a good rule of thumb. If you want people to play with you across time, if you want to engage in as many games as possible, and you want to participate in the ethic properly, then what you're aiming at is something approximating reciprocity. the rules that I outlined, in 12 Rules for Life, that's what they're based on. They're based on this observation. So this is how it works, is that we have these motivational systems and we get them together, maybe around the age of 2, and then we integrate them with the motivational systems of others. We do that by producing games. And the games get more and more sophisticated, more multiplicitous, but there's a game ethic that emerges out of that. And it governs reciprocity. And the game ethic is something like, well, we're all equally valuable players and everybody deserves a fair shot. And you got to bring your best skills to the table, but you have to play fair and you have to play reciprocally. And that works across time. And then you get an archetype that emerges out of that, which is something like the fair player. It's a variant of the archetype of the hero. And that's the thing that people are driven to imitate and admire. And this is hardly a mystery. I mean, you think, why do we pay professional athletes the inordinate sums that we pay them? Well, it's possible it's because they're modeling something of crucial importance in a dramatic manner. Like a basketball game, a professional basketball game is a very complex drama. And the drama is skill, but also the ethic of fair play. And we're all observing that because we bloody well need to understand it. And then you see that echoed. So you get the emergent ethic, and that's the pattern of behavior. And then you get representations of that. You get abstract representations of it. That's what we're doing when we play these abstract games. It's also what we do when we tell stories and we make movies and we present plays and we do everything that's dramatic, is that we take a look at that behavioral pattern that's emerged, that works, and then we try to represent it because we need to understand it. It's like, well, what are you like if you're the hero of a story? And what are you like if you're the anti-hero? You're the cheat, you're the crook, you're the deceiver, you're the liar, you're the poor sport, you're the person who fixes the game. And we abstract out those patterns and then we try to imitate them. And all of that that's what drives our knowledge of the ethic of behavior. We elaborate that up. We elaborate that up into drama, and we elaborate it into ritual, and we elaborate it into religious representations. We have stories that emerge of people who play properly and people who play improperly, and then you abstract out the essence of that. You say, well, what's it like to play properly? If you were doing it perfectly, what would you be like? Well, you'd be a target for emulation and imitation rather than a target for rejection. You get the archetype of the hero and the adversary come out of that. It's a completely different way of constructing a knowledge system. And I think that what I've been trying to do in Maps of Meaning and trying to do in 12 Rules for Life is to lay that out. Say, look, there is a system of knowledge that underlies the ethic that we need to adopt to conduct ourselves properly in life. And I'll close with this. Here's one way of conceptualizing it, I think. And this has to do with Rule 7. Do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. It also has to do with Rule 8, which is tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Well, it's not so easy to tell the truth, but you can tell when you're lying, and you can stop doing that. And then maybe you approximate the truth across time by doing that. You need to take care of yourself. But then you think, well, what does that mean exactly? It's not an Ayn Rand sort of individualism. And the reason for that is, what self do you mean? There isn't just you. There's you now and you tomorrow and you next week, you next month and you next year and you in a decade and you when you're old. You're a community and you're a creature, unlike other creatures, in that you're aware of your own duration. And so if you're going to treat yourself properly, you're already playing a game. It's a game you play with yourself across time. It's an iterated game, and you better play fair, because otherwise the you that is to come is going to suffer for it. And so there's no individual you outside of the community, because just because of the way you are, you're already a community. And so you have to take that into account. When you tell your child to play fair and be a good sport, you're doing that partly because then they're better for their teammates, but you're doing it mostly because then they're better for themselves across time, right? And you have an intimation of that. So you've got to treat yourself fairly. So the game's on with you. But then, you, the self, well, what is that? You think, what, are you more important than your family? That isn't how people act. If you take the typical parent, you say, well, look, I'm going to shoot you or I'm going to shoot your son. Well, the typical parent is going to say, well, take me. Well, you think, well, which is you then exactly? Is it, if what's you is what's most dear to you, what you identify with more, well, then you identify more with your kids and a tremendous amount with your parents and your siblings. It's like you're extended. You've got the community of yourself across time, but then you've got your family, and then you've got your family across time. Right? And then, well, there's that, but then your family's nested inside a community, and you've got the same issue there. You've got the community now, all those other people, and the community across time. So what's the ethic of fair play? It's like, do what's good for you in a way that's good for the future you, in a way that's good for your family and your future family, in a way that's good for the community and the future community. All of that unbelievably complex sequence of nested games, that's what you have to play properly. And you admire people who do play it properly, and you can see it, even though you might not be able to articulate it. Right? It's too complicated. And I would say it's a matter of balancing out things properly. And then to close, I would say this is something to think about too. We have an instinct for meaning. You can get meaningfully engaged in things. You might get meaningfully engaged in a basketball game, for example. You might ask yourself, why? And I shed some light on that. You're watching play progress properly, right? Maybe you follow the team across an entire championship because you don't give a damn about one basket successfully managed. And you don't give a damn about one game successfully won. You want the sequence of games to be won successfully so the championship manifests itself, and you're deeply embedded in that. You might track all the statistics because you care who wins the game that's iterated across time, and you're dramatizing that, you're playing that out. Even though you can't articulate it, you don't really understand it, it still grips you like it should, because that is what should grip you. Say, it grips you and it's engaging and it's meaningful, and the reason for that, okay, imagine this. This is the final part of this. Well, let's say you manage to take care of yourself and your family and your community all at the same time. Let's say that you imagine you're successful as a consequence of that. Like in the broad sense, right? You've got what it takes to live a rich life. Well, what's that going to do to you biologically? It's like, well, isn't that going to make you an attractive partner? Isn't that make you an attractive mate? And isn't it the case that if you're an attractive mate, because you act out that partner, that you're more likely to succeed from an evolutionary perspective? You're more likely to reproduce. Your children are more likely to live. And so what that implies across time is that not only does that ethic exist, not only do we recognize it, but that the degree to which you're able to manifest that self in your life is associated directly with your long-term success on a biological, speaking on the biological time frame, speaking in the biological time frame. Okay, so imagine that. Then imagine this. Imagine that you have instincts that guide you towards that pattern. I could tell you two of those. One is your conscience. And it says, you've fallen off the path. Well, what's the path? Well, the path is that balanced harmony, and you've deviated from it. You've betrayed yourself. You've cheated yourself. You're not playing the game properly with yourself, and something responds. And so that's the punishing end of it. And the positive end is, well, if you've got the pattern right, then it's deeply and meaningfully engaging, and that's not an illusion. One of the problems that modern people have is that we think that the sense of meaning is an illusion, because we think it's arbitrary or constructed. But there's no evidence for that. The evidence is quite the contrary, that sense of deep, meaningful engagement isn't rational at all. It's way deeper than that. And it signifies that you're where you should be doing what you should be doing. With a bit of a whack from time to time from your conscience. It says, well, walk the straight and narrow path, right? The line between chaos and order. And get everything balanced harmoniously around you, because that's where you should be and that's what you should be doing. I think that's portrayed in music. Music lays out patterns, layers of patterns, and they're all interacting harmoniously. And you can put yourself in sync with that, physically even, because you tend to dance to it. And you dance to that, and that's meaningful. And it's because you've allied yourself properly with all that multitudinous pattern. And it's a symbolic manner of what would you say, acting out, being positioned properly in the midst of all that complexity. And that's signified by that sense of meaning. Well, so that's a much better story than a moral relativist story or a nihilist story, a hopeless story. It's like you have an instinct for meaning, guided by conscience, that puts you in the proper orientation to yourself, extended across time, to your family, extended across time, and to your community, extended across time. And if you attend to that, then you act out things properly. And then not only do you feel better psychologically, you're facing the obstacles you need to face, you're playing the game properly. That's great psychologically. Gives your life some purpose and some higher meaning and protects you from anxiety and pain. Wonderful. But it's not just psychological. Because if you do that, you're also actually useful, right? You're taking care of yourself so you won't die. You're taking care of your family so they don't suffer unduly. And you're doing that in a manner that actually strengthens the community, right? You're taking on your role as a sovereign and responsible citizen. And that helps actually, it sets the world right psychologically, but it also sets the world right. So what's so arbitrary about that? I don't see anything arbitrary about that. I think it's long past time that we stopped regarding any of that as arbitrary. It's self-evident. Play the game properly. Right? It's important. Everyone knows it. You do it and your life is meaningful and worthwhile, and you've got something to wake up for, and you've got some anxiety set at bay. At least you've got something worthwhile to do in the face of what you're terrified of. That's something. And then there's important problems to solve, and you're solving them. It's like, well, that's separating the wheat from the chaff, right? I say, well, there's something to our civilized society that's integral and valuable, and that we need to protect and identify and then act out and support and manifest more and not criticize to death and leave nothing at all in the ashes. Well, and that's why I was working on Maps of Meaning and 12 Rules for Life. Thank you very much. These are the most comfortable chairs we've had.
Yeah, geez, wow.
Yeah,
look at these
maybe
chairs.
we'll just stay here.
Yeah, this is nice. It's good to be back, brother, right?
Yeah, it's good to be back.
You feeling good?
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you all for coming. It's much appreciated.
All right, we got a ton of questions because this is a tech town and they actually know how to use
They
an
know
app.
how to use Slido. That's good. Yeah, it's impressive.
I like this first one. Now that you've destroyed Patreon, will the two of you save the internet?
No, definitely not. There's no saving the internet. I don't know even if we'll save Patreon, because this is part of the not taking the moral high ground too easily. Dave and I, and Harris as well, Dave talked to Sam in particular, but Dave and I talked about what had happened after Patreon banned Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, and we thought, well, that's just not acceptable. And so we decided to stop using the platform, and I'd been working on a program that had some parallel functions to Patreon that we were producing for a slightly different reason, and we started talking about the possibility that it could be repurposed as a Patreon alternative, which is something that we're working diligently on and which will happen. But I would never claim that the solution to the problem is going to be straightforward. So we'll see what we can manage. I think Dave and I will start using the platform in about a month and a half, something like that. But we don't know. Maybe Patreon's time has come and gone already because there's already ways of supporting individual contributors. Maybe it's not possible to aggregate a tremendous number of creative people together in a single platform without attracting undue negative attention and the immediate probability of this kind of sensorial action. We don't know, right? Because these technologies are all so new. It looks like YouTube and Facebook are wrestling now, and Twitter as well, wrestling now with the conundrum that they've been presented with, which is, well, there's a billion opinions, and some of them are rough. What do we do about the rough opinions? And the answer might be, like in the frontier heyday of YouTube, when it wasn't run by a giant and increasingly rigid corporation, then anything went. But as soon as it's corporatized and systematized, then that can no longer work. I mean, you really think the internet could have ever started if it would have been regulated to begin with? I mean, just think about it. What drove the internet? Porn. I mean, no, but I'm dead serious, right? That's what happened, is that the internet exploded over its first, say, 10 years of development, of public development, because it was just it was like, what was the percentage of porn on the internet for the first 10 years? It was some ridiculous amount.
I didn't know that there was porn on the internet.
Oh, yeah.
See, everyone learns something at a Jordan Peterson event. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I don't know if it's a solvable problem, but we're going to try. I think at least we're going to try to build a platform where if you're on it, we're not going to kick you off arbitrarily. I think we can promise that. See, let me just say one more thing about that. So I went and talked to one of the guys who runs one of these big social communication systems, social networks. And they'd faced a lot of pressure because ISIS was using the platform to recruit. Okay, so you got to ask yourself, if you're a free speech absolutist, if you're in a war, you're going to let the enemies of your state recruit with your platform? And if the answer is no, which seems like a reasonable answer, well, then you've already opened the door, right? Say, there are things that could be censored. Then the question is, as soon as you open that door, like it's Pandora's box. It's like, okay, well, what about what's right next to that? Maybe that would be like certain forms of communication about radical religious fundamentalism, because that's right next door. And then there's something right next door to that. It's like, and those lines are really hard to draw. So it isn't obvious to me how large-scale social networks are going to solve this problem. And we're wrestling with that, trying to come up with a solution that's reasonable. So far, it's something like, you'll be able to stay on the platform unless you break an American law, an actual law, right? And I don't even know if that's a good enough guideline, but, well, it might have to be. But we'll see. And as for fixing the net, well, that's a no-go, that is. So we offer whatever content we can manage, and people seem to enjoy it, and that's working pretty well, but that's about all we can manage. And maybe that's all that's manageable.
And there's porn out there, so who knew? The APA recently defined traditional masculinity as toxic, conflating virtuous and harmful aspects. How can we reverse this dangerous ideological progression?
Oh, the purpose was to conflate the virtuous and the harmful. That's the purpose of the document, is to blur the distinction between the two. And I think the real reason, I'm writing an article about this right now, I think the actual reason was to damage the virtuous. Because that's the best way of doing it, right? If you want to damage the virtuous, what you do is you conflate it with the harmful. It doesn't hurt the harmful any to have it conflated with the virtuous. So let's say your real motivation is like a seriously deep resentment and spite. And that the best way to manifest that is to take the virtuous and conflate it with the pathological and to take down the virtuous. And maybe that's because you can't bloody manage it on your own. That's what it looks like to me. So I think the American Psychological Association put out a variety of very solid scientific journals for a very long period of time, and a couple of my friends sent me some of the articles that are going to be published in the next couple of months in some of the flagship journals like American Psychologist. And they're social justice oriented right to the damn core. And so that organization has become thoroughly corrupt. And it's really an appalling thing to see, because I liked being a clinical psychologist, and the training I had at McGill was top rate, man. It was very stringently scientific. I mean, clinical psychology isn't exactly a science any more than medicine is, or any more than engineering is, because there's practical engineering in it, right? I mean, if you're a clinical psychologist, you're trying to help people have better lives. You're not exactly trying to make them more mentally healthy. And even mental health is a very tricky thing to define, because you can't tell if it's normative or ideal. Like, it's a weird mixture of normative and ideal. But despite all that, you know, the clinical psychology programs, for a long time, they were very rigorous. They were hard to get into, and they were rigorous. And if you came out of them better than you were when you went in. You came out of them more knowledgeable, and you came out of them tougher and more resilient, because you had to learn how to cope with people's problems and not take them home, and to be mature enough to handle it. And it was really good. And for a long time, you know, when anybody ever asked me how to find a psychologist, I would say, well, find an American Psychological Association accredited clinical research program graduate, because you can be virtually certain that they will be trained enough and smart enough to at least be competent. You know, you've got a good crack at it, and they're just throwing that all away. It's really despicable in my estimation, and it makes me ashamed of my profession, and it's really too bad.
This got the third highest upvotes. Do you season your beef? And if so, what do you use?
I have such a stupid life, you know. Salt. And for those of you that care, my daughter, who invented this appalling diet, doesn't even use salt. So it's pretty bare bones, man. So that's that. But, you know, we've discovered that there's, what would you call it? There's variety in water. You can have, here's the variety. You can have hot water. That's sort of like tea without the tea. You can have cold water. That's a different kind. And you can have sparkling water. That's 3 kinds of water. And beef. And salt in my case. So...
Living the dream, man.
Yeah.
Actually, the best thing that I saw all year was the night that we had that dinner that I'm sure many of you saw the picture of, where it was Sam and Joe and Shapiro and all of us, and watching you and Rogan sit across from each other, each one of you eating like a 50-ounce tomahawk, like Fred Flintstone style. I was like, I am going to remember this. All right, we got a couple along this line. It's sort of a theme here. As a leader of a tech company, how can you break out of the SJW mood of expected values without risking your whole company?
Oh, fire all your HR people. Well, that was a really nasty thing to say, that I just said. But true. Well, the first thing is you have to decide if that's what you want to do. You have to actually make that decision, and then you have to act it out in all the small ways. You know, you're just not going to go there. You're going to decide not to go there and fight your battles along the way. You know, and so there'll be no talk about diversity, and there'll be no talk about inclusivity, and there'll be no talk about equity, and there'll be no talk about white privilege. What else? There'll be no talk about microaggressions, all of that stuff. And I can tell you, the tech people in here, if you think you can let any of that dogma into your company without letting all of it in, you are naive beyond belief. And if you think that what happened to the universities won't happen to your company, then you have the same problem, because it will. Because this set of ideas is not trivial. And you let any of it in. There isn't letting some of it in, That isn't how it works. And if you think you'll curry favor with the public by playing that game, you will in the short run with some people, but you'll risk your company. And if it's not something that you agree with, then you'll risk yourself too, because eventually you'll either come up against it and kowtow, or you'll come up against it and lose. So the first thing you have to do is decide that you're not going to do that. And then you have to make sure that you don't do it at all, because there's no doing it a little bit. So, I'm worried too that in the U.S. that this has gone far enough so that the STEM fields themselves are going to be at risk over the next 10 years. I mean, already in California, if you are a faculty member in one of the STEM fields, before you get hired at a California university, you have to write and sign a diversity document. So, and that's the same for promotion. And what the hell that has to do with the STEM fields is beyond me, except, I think that part of what's driving all of this, like what drove the APA statement, is an absolute hatred for competence itself. And the STEM types, that's why it's all power. That's why the discussion is all about power. Well, you occupy a high-level position in your hierarchy. Why? Power. Well, what else could it be? Could be competence. Well, God, no, not that, not competence. We can't admit that there's such a thing as competence, because it also means we'd have to admit that there's such a thing as incompetence, and maybe that characterizes like me, for example. So we're going to, instead of me dealing with my own pathetic incompetence, I'm just going to attack the notion of competence itself, and I'm going to do that by conflating it with power. And so, that's great, except when you need to build a bridge that stands up, because bridges don't stand up because power-hungry madmen built them. They stand up because competent people built them. If you build bridges, if you're a power-hungry madman, then when you make concrete, you put too much sand in it, because sand is cheap. That's what happened. That's what happened in the Soviet Union in many cases, but happens in all sorts of countries where corruption is the norm. It's like, that's fine, your building will stand up till there's an earthquake, and then it'll fall down. It's like, well, that's what happens when you have engineers that run off power. If you have engineers that run off competence, then things stand up, and that's how you can tell they're competent. And that's why the politically correct people hate engineers, is because you can tell when an engineer is competent because they build something that works. And that's really annoying, because it's evidence that there's competence. And that's annoying because that means there's evidence that there's incompetence, and your existence is the evidence. And so instead of rectifying your incompetence, you'll just get rid of the idea of competence. And then everything will fall down around you. But, well, then you'll all be equal in the rubbish, so that'll be fine. You can accomplish your equity goal that way, too.
What kind of music do you listen to? I was really trying to work a segue on that one. There was nothing there.
I listen to all sorts of music. I mean, I don't remember. There was a famous jazz musician who said there was only, was it Miles Davis? I don't remember. There's only two kinds of music, bad music and good music. And so that sort of runs across the genres. And I listen to all sorts of music. I listen to swing and jazz and old country from the 1950s and country swing from the 1930s and modern rock and roll, and I even listen to a little bit of hip-hop. It's not really my genre, but not much, It's I don't understand the genre very well. But It wasn't a Northern Albertan thing, man. So in classical music, and I like a very diverse range of music, and I listen to it very loud, especially when I'm driving around, which I really need to do much more of. So, yeah.
Was mainstream media always this bad,
No.
or are we just seeing it more now?
It's way worse. Yeah, it's way worse. All you have to do is go to the library and pick up a Time magazine from like 1973. It's a miracle. You can't even believe the bloody thing existed. It was like 100 pages long, and it was thick. You know, it's 3/8 of an inch thick, and when you open it, it doesn't look at all like People magazine. There's no photographs. It's all text, and the text is small, and the words mean things. And they were written by journalists who were paid, and they were fact-checked. And it's way worse than it was. But I think a lot of that is a technological. It's a side effect of technological revolution. You know, rather than pointing fingers at journalists or even at networks, let's say, you know, that all of the mainstream media is completely done in by the new media, right? So the print journalists, what are you going to put your print online with and compete head-to-head against 150,000 blogs? That's not going to work. And your television network, you're going to compete against online on-demand video? No. And your radio is going to compete against podcasts? No. So what we're seeing is that old media is being done in by the new media forms, and as it's done in, its quality is deteriorating, and its proclivity to exaggerate the polarization increases because it's the only way of gaining attention in a declining market. So rather than, you know, a set of moral failings, which it also is to some degree, I think it's just the inevitable consequence of an unbelievable technological revolution. And YouTube's a great example, right? Because think, what is it? YouTube has everything a network has, but a network doesn't have many of the things that YouTube has. So bandwidth is expensive for a network, and it's free for YouTube. And you need a huge organization to manage a network show, and you need like 3 people to manage a YouTube show. And YouTube has 2 billion potential viewers. And so how in the world can a television network compete with that? It can't. And podcasts are the same thing. So yes, the media is way worse than it used to be, but it's not surprising. I mean, Time magazine doesn't even pay its journalists anymore. So even the big newspapers have lost most of their good journalists. They've lost all their fact checkers. They're dying for lack of money. They can't monetize anything because Google has eaten up all the advertising revenue. So I think that quality degeneration is a consequence of just this insane technological revolution that's progressing. And, you know, who knows what's going to happen as a consequence of that. One of the things that I've seen that's been really strange is that it isn't so much that everybody is in their own bubble. It's that, it's not like that we've grouped together in bubbles. It's like each of us has a bubble now. And I watch people use the million channels of YouTube, and it's like everybody has their own news reality, right? And that's a strange thing too. One of the things we didn't understand, I think, about the classical media, say the TV stations of the 1970s and 1980s, 1970s in particular, when there was only really 3 TV stations, is we had no idea how uniting that was. You know, because we were all doing the same thing, at least from time to time. We all watched the same news. We were all kind of viewed the culture, at least more or less, through the same lens. And it was mediated by people who were reasonably respectable and competent. And that's just blown apart. And so there seems to be a real loss in that. And it's so strange that as the number of ways of communicating easily have multiplied, the possibility of communicating with everyone at once has disappeared. So it's so strange to see that blowing apart of a limitation actually eradicated something of tremendous utility, because you could there were times, this was true continually in the 60s and the 70s, where one event could grip the whole nation, and that was actually one of the ways of defining a nation. And that's disappearing incredibly quickly, and it's not clear that we can handle the fragmenting consequences of that. So
we got work to do with this platform, huh? What inspires you?
This is good. Yeah, so Dave mentioned that. So I think this is the 116th city that I've been in since a year. My book came out a year ago, so it's basically a year anniversary. I think to the day, actually. I mean, so what's inspiring? Well, first of all, I discovered this year that there's a huge market for discourse at the highest level that I can manage. That doesn't necessarily mean it's high-level discourse, but it's the best that I can manage. There's a market for that. That's really interesting. One of the things, Dave and I have talked about this, this group of us has been given this nomenclature, the intellectual dark web, and that happened accidentally. And we'd been trying to puzzle through what caused that grouping. And one of the things that characterizes everybody who's in that category is that each of us has an independent media platform and isn't beholden to anyone for it. So there's an independence there, financial and practical. But then there's another issue too, which is that there isn't a single person in that group who thinks their audience is stupid. And that's also, I think, at least in part, a consequence of the new technology. Because if you run a television station, the technology makes your audience feel stupid to you. And there's a bunch of reasons for that are worth thinking through. So the first reason is you can't produce a show and assume that your audience has seen any other show that you've ever produced. So you have to assume that you're talking to someone who has no memory, right? And then you have to appeal to the lowest common denominator. And then the bandwidth is extraordinarily expensive, so you can't explain anything in detail. So basically, if you run a television station, you're talking to someone who has attention deficit disorder and Alzheimer's. Right. And so you can't help but think of your audience as not very bright when you're looking at them through an aperture that's only this wide. And then with the new technology, with YouTube and with podcasts, it's like, well, the doors are open, man. It's like, and so Rogan starts to experiment with 3-hour podcasts. Who the hell would have ever thought that was a good idea? Right, so you all think it's a good idea. And it's the same thing happened with entertainment. Is like the rule on network TV for a long time was, you can't expect an audience to have more than a 90-minute attention span. A movie, that's as long as they can ever manage. And that's like, Game of Thrones comes out. It's like 200 hours long. And there's 50 plot lines or 60 plot lines, and people have absolutely no problem whatsoever following it. And so it turns out that we're way smarter than we thought we were. And one of the things that's inspired me over the last year and a half, let's say, or so, is the realization of that. And then, so I've talked to about 250,000 people now in this way. And it's amazing that people will come out. Like, is it Saturday? What day is it?
I think today is Wednesday. I've been busy too.
Oh, I have no idea what day it was. I mean, I'm not even sure what time it is.
Do not put that on Twitter, please.
Anyways, look, it's remarkable that 3,000 people will come out to have a discussion like this. And I was rereading 12 Rules for Life today, and because I was trying to update my memory again. And, it's a way easier book than Maps of Meaning was. But it's still a hard book. And I didn't think that when I was writing it, but when I reread it tonight, I thought, this book is a lot harder than I thought it was. And yet it's sold 3 million copies now. And so so that's inspiring. It's inspiring to see how much of a market there is for a serious discussion about how we could get our individual lives together and make things like solidly better. That's really inspiring, and it's really real as far as I can tell. And so I can't imagine anything better than that, and which is why I keep doing this. I mean, it's ridiculously exciting to do it, but it's also remarkable. I can't believe it that it keeps rolling along, and that I can have these sorts of discussions with a very large number of people and millions of people online. So, you know, because I've always talked about the most serious things that I could formulate in my classes, and then, you know, that worked on YouTube, which was quite the damn shock, and it's worked in podcasts, and then it works in this format. That's really something. So, yeah.
Well, it's inspiring for me to be back at it with you. So on that note, I'm going to get out of the way and make some noise for Jordan Peterson, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Rubin. Thank you, everyone. It was very nice talking with you, and thanks for coming. Good night.
If you found this conversation meaningful, you might think about picking up Dad's books, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, or his newer bestseller, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. Both of these works delve much deeper into the topics covered in the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. See jordanbpeterson.com for audio, ebook, and text links, or pick up the books at your favorite bookseller. And check out jordanbpeterson.com/personality for information on his new course. I really hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, please leave a rating at Apple Podcasts, a comment or review, or share this episode with a friend. Thanks for tuning in, and talk to you next week.
Follow me on my YouTube channel, Jordan B. Peterson, on Twitter at Jordan B. Peterson, on Facebook at Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, and at Instagram at jordan.b.peterson. Details on this show, access to my blog, information about my tour dates and other events, and my list of recommended books can be found on my website, jordanbpeterson.com. My online writing programs, designed to help people straighten out their pasts, understand themselves in the present, and develop a sophisticated vision and strategy for the future, can be found at selfauthoring.com. That's selfauthoring.com. From the Westwood One podcast.